Hello and welcome to this video series on the Moog Modular, the emulation by Arturia, an awesome synthesizer and the daddy of the Moog family. This is the thing that spawned the Mini Moog that went on to basically own the 70s. The Moog Modular was completely unusable in a live system. Some bands did attempt to do it and succeeded to a limited extent, but completely unfeasible. It was designed to be built in a studio, in a room, and filled the whole goddamn thing. They were huge. So the Mini Moog was like a pared down version of that. And it can be a little bit daunting to figure out. I mean, look at the thing. It's just crazy. It's just an absolute massive knobs and buttons. So we're going to approach it from two perspectives. Firstly, I'm going to show you the core modules. In a series of videos, I'll break down the modules into their individual components. I'll say this is what this thing does, and so we'll get a basic understanding of the synth from the modular perspective, and then we'll start deconstructing some of the presets that the sound engineers from Arturia have developed, and we'll figure out how they've come to arrive at these awesome sounds by reverse engineering those presets. So without further ado, let's just dive in and try to make some sound. So as things stand at the moment, you can see that there are no cables. All of these little jacks can have cables plugged between them, and that's how modular systems work. You plug one thing into another, and at the moment there are no modules connected together. So when I press a key on a keyboard, which I just did, nothing happens. So we need to get some sound out of the thing. And the absolute minimum we're going to need in order to do that musically is to use an oscillator and a VCA. So let's talk about those two things. Over here we have our Oscillator Bank. And the Oscillator Bank contains three completely independent oscillators at a top level. So this here is Oscillator 1. But that oscillator itself, that sound generator, is then subdivided into a master oscillator called the driver, and then three slaves, oscillators 1, 2, and 3. That are slaves to this master. So for the time being, ignore all of these because they're oscillators 2 and 3 and they do the same thing. So we're just going to concentrate on oscillator 1 over here. So to get some sound out of the master, we have to plug a slave into it, or we're going to plug a slave into it. Very rare in the modular world you say you have to do something, but bear with me. So we're going to generate a sine wave. See this little sine symbol down here? So this is an output jack, and I'm going to plug this output jack into an amplifier. And the amplifiers are down here. So we have 16 of them, and they are completely independent. It's really easy to think that these are fundamentally connected to the oscillators above. They are not. They're completely independent. So everything that you see in this bottom section down here is not connected in any way to the stuff up above. So we're going to take a sine wave out of an oscillator and we're going to send it into, see this, in an amplifier. This oscillator is now going to output its signal into this amplifier. Now we need to get this sound out. Here's our out section. So this, draw a line through the middle of those jacks there, and let's not worry about what they are for now. This here is one amplifier. Okay, so we've come in from the sine wave, out of the amplifier, and into the VCA. So this is the voltage controlled amplifier. This is your master output. If you don't plug something into a VCA in a modular system, you're not going to get any sound. This is the thing that's connected to the outside world and will drive sound to your speakers. And that's it. that's the absolute minimum we need to do in order to get sound out of our keyboard. If I now press a key on my keyboard, I get a sine wave. Press a note an octave higher. That's really important. And an octave higher again. It's not taken for granted that a modular synthesizer will generate the chromatic notes of a keyboard. When I do that, that's not completely taken for granted, but we've got a working synthesizer now. If I didn't want a sine wave, I can take that away. You click on it comes out of here and into here, and if you take it out of the out socket, it disappears. If I put that back again, and I take something out of the output, it doesn't necessarily kill the old one. You can have any number of outputs, but you can only ever have one input into these jacks. So let's change it from a sine wave to a triangle. Okay, now we get a different sound. It's a triangle. And here we have a saw. Okay, and finally a pulse. So those are the four fundamental different types of waves that the Moog can generate using these oscillator banks. Okay, that's our simplest possible sound. But obviously it's not very interesting. So now you start to think about what you can do to make that sound more interesting. So for this video, let's just concentrate exclusively on Oscillator 1 and try to make interesting sounds with that, not using any of the other modules. So here we have, we're using a pulse wave at the moment. You can see this little pulse symbol down here. And it sounds like that. Why does it sound like that? Because that's the current setting of this oscillator's pulse width. So this knob here, which currently says 0.5, I'm going to hold the note down. So those are all the different pulse widths. As I'm turning that knob, it's changing the shape of the wave that's being generated by that oscillator. The pulse width is, if you imagine a square wave, so this is what a square wave looks like. In fact, you can see each of the four different types of sounds that the Moog's just generated then. This is from Wikipedia. These are your basic types of sound wave. And here is what a square wave looks like. Now, that's one type of pulse wave. This is another type of pulse wave. And here, this is the pulse width. And as we turn that knob, the width of that pulse there changes. As we increase the knob, it goes up to 50%. And then as we reduce it, that pulse gets narrower and narrower and narrower. Now, once you go past 50%, you could theoretically carry on. But what you're doing then is just the opposite of what you're doing when you go narrower. Because a pulse wave doesn't care whether or not the pulse is like high or low, whether the wide bit is at the top or the bottom. So giving you a range up to, let's go back to our, see, the highest rate we can have is 0.5. That actually gives you the full range of flexibility of your pulse wave, because everything above 0.5 is the same as everything below. It's just a mirror image. So that's what it sounds like at 0.5. That's a square wave. Because the width of the pulse at the top, I don't want to get too much into this, but the width of the pulse at the top is the same as the width of the pulse at the bottom. It's literally spends half of its time at the top, then goes down to the bottom, and half of its time at the bottom. That's a square wave. And as we pull this in, we change the nature of the pulse. So now we've got almost no sound. So the pulse wave is a tiny, tiny sliver of wave the width is incredibly narrow, and so we get almost no sound. If it completely flatlined at the bottom, we would get absolutely nothing at all. That's as close to nothing as the modular can get. And then we start generating tone. So that's one way that you can make sounds more interesting with the oscillators. But that's a static thing. That pulse width is static. How do we make it not be static? Well, we have a modulation wheel. Now my camera's not set up, but I have a modulation wheel on my keyboard, which I'm currently turning up and down. And as I play keys on the keyboard and I'm mashing the modulation wheel, nothing happens. There's no change to the sound. But if I take an output from this modulation jack down here into one of these two, let's just stop for a moment. There are 4 jacks over here. 2 of them have FM labelled against them. Worry about that in a minute. These 2 have PWM labelled against them. That stands for pulse width modulation. So if we send an output from our modulation wheel into one of these PWM sockets, we're going to have the ability to alter the width of the pulse. We're going to have an opportunity to change this knob using our modulation wheel. And the way we do it is a little bit secret, it's a little bit kind of hidden. These sockets here, any input socket, is actually a variable control. And you can see that with this tiny little orange dot above. If you click on the metal part of the socket where it says 0 and then drag up with your mouse, that's actually a variable control. So let's set it there. So it's about 3 o'clock. Now I'm going to turn my modulation wheel all the way down, play a note on the keyboard, turn my modulation wheel up, and I've applied 25% of a change to whatever the pulse width knob was when we started. So back down to 0 again, set that back to 25. So down 0, up to max, back down to 0 again. Set this all the way up to full, 0, all the way up to full. So that's how much we're changing the pulse width by when we move our modulation wheel. So these 2 sockets here both do that. I could put that cable in here and have exactly the same control. So I've got the means of having 2 different amounts of change to that thing that's going to happen from an outside source. I'm going to set one to 0.8, one to 0.3, and then different things can have different effects. So it's just a means of giving you a little bit more flexibility. So, okay. Now the other 2, frequency modulation, basically mean that now when I move my modulation wheel, the pitch of the tone is going to go up. Make that effect more dramatic. Okay. And, like I said earlier, outputs can have multiple cables attached to them. So now we're affecting both the pitch and the pulse width. Bring that down a little bit so it's not quite so dramatic. You can hear that the tone of the sound is changing and the pitch at the same time. Pretty cool. So now we're getting some genuinely interesting sounds coming out of the oscillator. Okay. But that's just one of the slave oscillators that's hooked in to this master oscillator, if you like. And we can have more oscillators feeding into the sound as well. Let's make it a little bit simpler again. Take these away and just drag in the output socket and just pull in the cable somewhere else, and then it just disappears. So now we're back to no control from the modulation wheel. Let's add a sine wave to that sound. How are we going to do that? Well, let's take our second slave oscillator. So I've got my cable, and I'm going to feed it into this mixer socket down here. But I don't want to have a second output. I only want to drive both of these oscillators from a single output location. So I link the two amplifiers together. So by clicking this little link button here, remember when I said earlier, draw an imaginary line through the middle of these knobs, these buttons? It's because these buttons here straddle the two amplifiers that they're in between. They allow you to apply some effect to groups of amplifiers, and the link button allows you to connect these two amplifiers together. So now what's going to happen is that this output here, the left hand one of the amplifiers, now contains the sum of both of those outputs. So it contains this plus this. Now at the moment you can't hear that sine wave at all, because the amplifier for the second input, this volume knob down here, is at 0. There's the sine wave coming in. Mix those two together. So now we have a more complex and more interesting sound. It's a bit of sine wave and a bit of pulse wave, and they've been merged together by linking those two knobs together. One thing to bear in mind with the linking system is that even though these two amplifier controls are now linked, and the left hand one of the group outputs the sum of everything, the individual controls, the individual amplifiers still work. They still generate tone. So if I throw this cable away and instead take an output from this second amplifier down here, we'll get just the sine wave. Okay, so that amplifier is still working, it's still doing a job, but in addition to doing its own job and kind of not caring what anyone else in the world is doing, it's also feeding in to the linked amplifier. And if we want that linked amplifier to have no input from the sine wave, we'd have to either turn it down or unlink it. So you see, even though we've still got the sine wave plugged into this amplifier down here, amplifier 2, because it's got no output, it's not doing anything. You've got that signal going in somewhere, but it's not coming out. Link it back together. Okay. The driver has a master frequency. As do each of the individual oscillators. If I right click, get fine control, that's a right click. Left click, semitone control. So now I can change this oscillator here to have a little bit of positive fine control, this one a little bit of negative, and you just get a little bit of imbalance between those. They're no longer generating exactly the same pitch, and that makes an interesting colour to the sound. So you can mess quite nicely with merged oscillators just by tweaking their fine controls a little bit. You don't want to go, I mean, you might want to, but if you go full semitones, you know, that's difficult to make sound good. You could have something generating, like that's a fifth. You know, a really classic kind of analog sound. Perfect fifth is seven semitones is a perfect fifth interval. Just not worry about that. And finally, for this video, we've got the range knob. So this allows you to jump up entire octaves. So now we've got a high sine wave and a low pulse wave. Okay, so that's a basic introduction to a single oscillator and how to get some interesting sounds out of it. And we used a little bit of Mod Wheel and a little bit of amplifier linking. But at this stage, I don't want to blow your mind. Can't teach you everything all at once. This is just a really simple introduction to how to get some interesting sounds out of an oscillator. So I hope that's been interesting. Next time we'll dive into the wonderful world of filters. I hope you'll join me then. Thanks very much for watching.